Learning to play jazz chords on the guitar can be very confusing. I'm going to show you the most logical way I know of learning these chord shapes on the guitar. Remember, jazz chords are simply major and minor chords with additional notes on them to give them color. Similarly, we're going to take basic chord shapes on the guitar, change a few notes around a little bit to create these more involved chord sounds. First of all, I'll start with a simple open E major chord. Now I'll move that chord shape with the bar up to a C major chord at the 8th fret. I could have moved this shape to anywhere on the fingerboard, but I really like to do chords in C, and all the chords that we'll do in the program and on the booklet will have a C root. Let's see what we've got. We have a root, a fifth, a root, the major third, the fifth, and the root. So even though we're playing 6 notes, we really only have just the triad. So we want to change things around to make it sound like a jazz chord. Let's give ourselves a couple of rules. First of all, we only need 4 notes, and for the most part that's going to be 1 finger per note. We want to get at least 1 juicy jazz tone in there, like a major 7th. And we want to avoid doubling any notes. We don't need 2/3 or 2/5. That gives a chord an unbalanced sound and wastes a finger and a string on something that could be more interesting. So if we take our C chord and we eliminate the note on the 1st and the 5th string, and take the root on the 4th string and lower it a half step to the major 7th, we end up with a C major 7th chord. Simply mute the other 2 notes by draping the 1st finger over the strings. Now, this is a wonderful sounding chord, and major 7th chords are very, very common in jazz. And with any other chord shape, you want to move it around. B major, B flat major 7, D flat major 7. But the other thing that this chord gives us is a template, a form that we can vary to get other chords. All we do is apply the laws of theory to the guitar fingerboard. For instance, if we take the major 7th on the 4th string and lower it a half step to the flat 7th, we end up with a C7 or C dominant 7 chord. If we take the 3rd, the major 3rd on the 3rd string, and lower it a half step to the minor 3rd, we end up with a C minor 7 chord. Notice the fingering with the 2nd finger and the half bar with the 3rd finger. If we take our 5th on the 2nd string and lower it a half step, we end up with a C minor 7 flat 5 or C half diminished 7th chord. And if we take our minor 7th and lower it another half step on the 4th string to the diminished 7th or 6th, we end up with a C diminished 7 chord. Notice I'm only using a half bar with the 1st finger, not a whole bar. Only press down what you need. Now, one law of theory states that we don't need to have the 5th in the chord. This means we can take that string and do something a little bit more interesting with it. The most common example of this is to take this C7 chord and to move the 5th on the 2nd string up a whole step, 2 frets, to C13, which is a slightly more involved C7 chord. Not only is this chord a little bit more embellished in sound, it's easy to finger, so it's a very, very common chord shape. These chord shapes and some other neat chord shapes from this particular area are available for review on page 1 of the booklet. Now let's move to another area of the fingerboard. We'll start off by playing an open A chord, and now we'll move that up to a C chord at 3rd fret. At this point we don't need to worry about the top string, all we're worrying about are the inner 4 strings. Now watch, we have a root, a 5th, another root, and a major 3rd. If we take the higher of the 2 roots and lower that a half step, we end up with another major 7th chord, voiced, root, 5th, major 7, 3rd. Again, another very good sounding chord shape and another template that we can vary. If we lower the 7th a half step, from the major 7th to the minor 7th, the flatted 7th on the 3rd string, we end up with a C7 chord. Now I've got to tell you, I'm not very fond of this chord. I'm going to recommend something different in just a second. But let's push on. If you lower the major 3rd to the minor 3rd on the 2nd string, you end up with a C minor 7 chord. If you lower the 5th on the 4th string to the flat 5th, you end up with a C minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished 7th chord. Now you could have put a bar in there, but most players are just going to put 1 finger per note. Now if you take the flat 7 and lower another half step to the diminished 7th or 6th, you end up with a C fully diminished 7th chord. These chord shapes and some other neat chords from this particular area you can find on page 2 of your booklet. Now in bar chording, all the chord shapes are based out of an E or A shape, but a lot of the really cool jazz chords from a fifth string root actually come out of a C or C7 shape. Watch. Here's an open C chord, and I'm only playing the middle four strings. Sure doesn't sound like a jazz chord. If you raise the fifth, the open G, up to the B flat with the fourth finger, we end up with a C7 chord. And by the way, this chord shape you can move around. Look at what we have. We have a root, a third, a flat 7, and another root. Now we know that we don't need this other root, so this time let's raise it a whole step. We're going to take this note and raise it a whole step, 2 frets on the second string, and end up with a C9 chord, voiced root, major third, flat 7, and 9. This is the dominant chord I want you to use instead of the dominant chord I didn't like a second ago. Again, let's apply some rules of theory to this shape. If we lower the major third to the minor third on the fourth string, we end up with a C minor ninth, a really nice alternative to the minor 7 chord. If we had taken our flat 7 and raised it to a major 7th, we end up with a C major 9, which is a really nice alternative to the major 7th chord. These chord shapes and some other really neat chord shapes from this area you can find on page 3 of your booklet. These basic chords that we've covered are the most important chords for young jazz guitarists to learn. They're going to be very, very valuable in your ensemble. They're not too difficult to finger, and all the pros use them. So this is a good place for us to start with our jazz chords.